Welcome to today's story, 1935. When Lucky Luciano discovered Bumpy Johnson was the sharpest mind in Harlem. Harlem in 1935 was a boiling pot of culture, power, pressure. On the surface, it was the height of the Harlem Renaissance, jazz clubs glowing at night, poets and thinkers reshaping black excellence, and community leaders fighting for dignity during a time when racism was openly institutional. Underneath the glamour, Harlem was also a battleground of economic desperation, exploited labor, and corrupt politics. Tension between local residents and heavy-handed police enforcement kept the streets on edge. Businesses struggled under unfair treatment, while poverty and unemployment drove many young men toward the underground economy, gambling, numbers running, protection rackets, smuggling. Within this world, power was divided sharply along racial lines. Italian mob bosses controlled much of the city's organized crime, but Harlem's black community was fiercely protective of its own leadership. Madame Stephanie St. Clair, known as the Queen of Harlem, held enormous influence through the numbers game and fought relentlessly to keep white gangsters from taking over black neighborhoods. Her defiance created a dangerous climate as Italian mobs sought control through intimidation, violence, and political pressure. Police corruption added another layer of chaos. Officers looked the other way when paid, cracked down when ordered, targeted black residents disproportionately. This gave the Italian mob an advantage in muscle, but it also fueled resistance from those who refused to bow to outside control. In the middle of this volatile environment, a new figure was rising, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, known for his sharp mind, calm demeanor, and ability to read people like a chessboard. Bumpy became a key player in defending Harlem's autonomy. By 1935, Harlem was a place where every move could shift power, spark retaliation, or forge unlikely alliances. And it was within this landscape of cultural brilliance and criminal tension that Lucky Luciano began hearing whispers about a man in Harlem whose intelligence and strategic thinking surpassed anyone he had encountered in the underworld. Bumpy Johnson. Before Bumpy Johnson ever became a feared or respected figure in Harlem's underworld, he was known for something very different: his mind. Long before the newspapers labeled him a gangster, Harlem locals recognized him as the quiet man who could sit at a chessboard for hours, calculating moves not just for the game, but for life itself. Chess wasn't just a pastime for Bumpy, it became the foundation of how he viewed power, loyalty, and survival. Each opponent was a different kind of threat, each piece a resource to be used with precision, not emotion. Born in South Carolina and raised in a world that gave young black men few choices, Bumpy learned early that quick thinking was his only true weapon. When he arrived in New York, Harlem was exploding with new ideas, businesses, and cultural expression, but also scams, hustles, and violent turf wars. Bumpy drifted through pool halls, room gambling spots, and street corners where deals were negotiated with whispers and handshakes. People noticed that Bumpy wasn't the loudest or the strongest. He was the one who watched everything and forgot nothing. His path changed when he caught the attention of Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the reigning boss of Harlem's numbers racket. She didn't choose her inner circle lightly. Intelligence meant more to her than muscle. She saw something in the young man that others missed: the ability to outthink opponents 2 or 3 steps ahead. Under her mentorship, Bumpy learned how to manage money, negotiate territory, track betrayals, and sense danger before it arrived. What truly set Bumpy apart was his discipline. Where others acted impulsively, he studied patterns, how people moved, how money flowed, how alliances shifted. He understood that Harlem wasn't just streets and businesses, it was a complex ecosystem of power, culture, fear, pride. His calmness during chaos earned respect. His loyalty earned trust. His strategic thinking earned fear. By 1935, Bumpy had transformed from a quiet chess hustler into the brain of Harlem's resistance against outside takeover. He wasn't just a lieutenant, he was the strategist behind the scenes, coordinating moves like a grandmaster planning a flawless checkmate. Word of his intelligence began spreading beyond Harlem's borders, eventually reaching the ears of one of the most influential crime figures in America, Lucky Luciano. And that's where the story shifts, because once Luciano heard rumors of a man who could outthink veteran gangsters, he wanted to meet him for himself. By 1935, Lucky Luciano had already transformed himself from a street enforcer into a visionary architect of American organized crime. Unlike earlier mob bosses who operated through raw violence and ethnic loyalty, Luciano believed in structure, efficiency, and building something bigger than any single gang. New York was chaotic: Irish mobs, Jewish syndicates, Italian families, Harlem's black gambling kings, corrupt politicians, and independent street crews all clashed constantly. Money was being made. Too much of it was being lost to turf wars, ego battles, and unplanned violence. Luciano saw the future differently. His plan was simple but revolutionary: unify everything. He created what would become known as the Commission, a governing body designed to manage disputes, assign territories, regulate profits, and prevent unnecessary bloodshed. To Luciano, crime wasn't about chaos, it was a business that needed rules, leadership, and long-term strategy. He studied power structures like a corporate executive. He knew the Italian mobs alone couldn't control New York. Harlem, with its booming numbers racket and its fiercely loyal community, was too strong and too organized to simply crush or take over. The problem was Dutch Schultz. Schultz was unpredictable, violent, and openly racist in how he viewed Harlem's leadership. His obsession with controlling black gambling operations was causing instability. He ignored commission decisions, insulted his own allies, used brute force that brought police heat and political attention, both things Luciano hated. Stability required intelligence, respect, cooperation across racial lines. Schultz, with his reckless raids and shootouts, represented the opposite. Luciano realized that if Harlem was going to be part of the larger organized system, he needed someone there who could be reasoned with, someone strategic, disciplined, and respected by Harlem residents, someone who understood chess, not chaos. That's when he began hearing whispers about a man who didn't just run operations, he calculated them. A man who could predict enemy moves, manage people without intimidation, and navigate Harlem's complex cultural landscape like no outsider ever could. Luciano wasn't interested in conquering Harlem by force. He wanted to integrate it into his new order. To do that, he needed the smartest mind Harlem had to offer. And every informant, bookmaker, and street runner he questioned gave him the same name, Bumpy Johnson. This sparked Luciano's curiosity. He didn't send a hit squad, he sent scouts, advisors, and observers. He wanted to know who Bumpy was, how he thought, how he handled threats, and whether he could be an ally instead of an enemy. In Luciano's mission to stabilize New York's underworld, meeting Bumpy wasn't just an option, it became a necessity. The closer Luciano looked, the more he realized he wasn't dealing with an ordinary street figure, but a rare mind capable of reshaping the balance of power in ways no one expected. The meeting between Lucky Luciano and Bumpy Johnson did not happen by accident. It was engineered through the formidable presence of Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the undisputed queen of Harlem's numbers empire. In 1935, St. Clair was one of the most powerful black businesswomen in the country. She operated with intelligence, political connections, and iron will. Everyone in Harlem knew she controlled the numbers racket, and she had no intention of allowing white mobsters to infiltrate her territory. When Luciano's scouts reported that Bumpy wasn't just a street lieutenant, but a strategic thinker guiding Harlem's resistance, Luciano understood who the real power behind him was: St. Clair. If Luciano wanted peace, partnership, or even a conversation with Bumpy, he needed her permission first. St. Clair was not easy to approach. She distrusted outsiders, especially Italian mobsters, because she had seen the damage Dutch Schultz inflicted when he tried to strong-arm Harlem. St. Clair had already survived assassination attempts, police raids, political smear campaigns, and open warfare against Schultz's men. She had earned her throne through intelligence and defiance, not fear. So when Luciano sent word requesting a neutral conversation, St. Clair didn't immediately respond. She observed, she listened, she measured Luciano's intentions. She knew he was different from Schultz, more strategic, less impulsive, more interested in stability than domination. She also understood that dealing with him meant stepping into a larger national criminal structure. St. Clair was not going to be bullied or bought. After several private discussions with her advisors, and after watching Luciano distance himself from Schultz's escalating chaos, she recognized an opportunity. A dialogue with Luciano might protect Harlem from another violent takeover attempt. Instead of meeting Luciano herself, St. Clair chose Bumpy Johnson as her representative. This was a calculated move. Bumpy was not only her most trusted lieutenant, he was the one man who could sit across from Luciano and hold his ground intellectually. His calmness, strategic thinking, and loyalty made him the perfect envoy. He could negotiate without being intimidated, and he understood both Harlem culture and underworld mathematics well enough to speak Luciano's business language. A controlled, private meeting was arranged through intermediaries at a discreet location in Manhattan, not in Harlem, not in Little Italy, but a neutral spot where no gang's presence dominated. Both sides arrived with caution. Luciano brought 2 lieutenants, not a small army, signaling respect. St. Clair sent Bumpy alone, signaling confidence. This first meeting wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, tense, and filled with unspoken power. Luciano studied Bumpy carefully, trying to see whether the man matched the rumors. Bumpy observed Luciano equally, reading his expression, tone, and strategy like moves on a chessboard. It was in this moment, facilitated entirely by St. Clair's sharp political instincts, that 2 of the sharpest minds in New York crime history came face to face, and the stage was finally set for Luciano to test Bumpy's intelligence for himself. When Luciano finally sat across from Bumpy Johnson, he didn't begin with threats, alliances, or territory talk. He started with numbers because in Luciano's world, numbers never lie. Logic, profit, efficiency, these were the tools he used to judge a man's value. And he wanted to know whether Harlem's rising strategist actually deserved the reputation that had reached his ears. So Luciano leaned back, lit a cigarette, and opened the conversation with what seemed like casual business math. But these weren't simple questions. They were traps disguised as arithmetic, calculations designed to reveal how someone thinks under pressure. He asked Bumpy about projected profits from running the numbers game across multiple districts with varying rates of police interference. Then he shifted to questions about supply chains, how to move goods discreetly through territories that didn't cooperate, how to reduce losses from raids, and how to balance payouts across different neighborhoods without raising suspicion. Bumpy didn't flinch. He listened quietly, nodding occasionally, then responded with sharp, measured answers. He broke everything down with precision, calculated street percentages without hesitation, adjusted variable risks based on police heat, projected earnings with multiple contingency plans, outlined preventive strategies to avoid rival interference. What caught Luciano off guard wasn't just that Bumpy knew the math, it was that he understood the patterns behind the math. Bumpy didn't think like a typical street boss. He thought like an analyst. He didn't just answer Luciano's questions. He anticipated the ones coming next. Every response showed not only intelligence but structure. Luciano's two lieutenants exchanged looks. They had seen tough guys, smart guys, and ambitious guys, but rarely someone who could process complex numbers and strategy in real time with this kind of calmness. One of them later admitted he felt like he was watching a businessman in a boardroom, not a Harlem numbers lieutenant. Luciano pushed harder. He began creating hypothetical problems, losses from a bad week, sudden police crackdowns, territorial conflicts, even betrayal within the ranks. These were scenarios that could break most operations. Bumpy responded each time with strategies that were quick, disciplined, creative, and shockingly effective. He even corrected Luciano on a projected loss calculation respectfully, but confidently, showing a deeper grasp of real street economics than many long, established mob accountants. Luciano didn't show it on his face. Internally, he was impressed. This was the moment he realized the rumors weren't exaggerated. Bumpy Johnson was operating on another level. He saw the angles, the risks, and the opportunities like a grandmaster studying a chessboard with every piece in motion. By the time the conversation ended, Luciano understood two things clearly. Bumpy wasn't just smart, he was one of the sharpest minds in the entire city. Trying to take Harlem by force would be a disaster. Working with Bumpy was the only logical path forward. This quiet test of numbers, strategy, and intelligence would become the turning point that changed how Luciano viewed Harlem and how he viewed Bumpy. As the meeting continued, Luciano's lieutenants began paying closer attention to Bumpy than to their own boss. These were seasoned men, veterans of street wars, financial collectors, and negotiators who had spent years dealing with bookies, racketeers, and hustlers. They had met hundreds of ambitious young gangsters, most of whom tried to impress with bravado or intimidation. Bumpy Johnson was different. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't brag. He didn't posture. He simply responded with a calmness that felt unnerving, like a man who knew he had nothing to prove. At first, the lieutenants expected him to stumble. Luciano's questions were designed to trip people up, to expose fear, impatience, or ignorance. But instead, Bumpy answered each one with flawless accuracy. His calculations were instantaneous, his logic airtight, and his tone steady. Bumpy didn't just give answers, he gave reasons behind the answers. He wasn't just reacting, he was analyzing. He wasn't intimidated by Luciano's presence. He was focused on the structure of the problem. This is when the lieutenants started exchanging glances, not hostile, surprised, not skeptical, impressed. They began to realize something rare. Bumpy was a thinker, not just a fighter. Even more shocking was Bumpy's ability to challenge assumptions without sounding confrontational. When presented with hypothetical risks or financial breakdowns, he would calmly say, "That projection doesn't account for street fluctuation during police sweeps. The number will drop by 18 to 22% depending on the neighborhood." It was the type of correction no one dared make to Luciano lightly. Yet, Bumpy did it respectfully, showing his knowledge came not from arrogance, but from first-hand experience with Harlem's economic pulse. His understanding wasn't theoretical, it was lived, observed, and perfected over years. Luciano's lieutenants began to see what St. Clair saw, a man who could break down problems faster than most accountants, a man who could foresee conflicts before they erupted, a man who didn't panic when tested. The moment that truly stunned them came when Luciano presented a scenario about sudden territory loss and reduced manpower, an intentional stress test. Most gang leaders would respond with talk of retaliation or violence. But Bumpy offered a completely different approach. Restructure the payout system, consolidate trusted runners, shift operations temporarily to stable districts, reduce exposure while maximizing internal loyalty. It wasn't just smart, it was efficient, strategic, and humane compared to the typical mob responses. The lieutenants realized that Bumpy didn't think like a street boss. He thought like a chess master. He thought like a man who saw 10 moves ahead. By the end of the conversation, Luciano's lieutenants weren't just impressed, they were uneasy, because intelligence like this was rare and dangerous and powerful. They understood what Luciano was beginning to see as well. Bumpy Johnson wasn't someone you could intimidate or control. He was someone you needed to respect and work with. This realization shifted the entire energy of the room. What started as a test turned into the beginning of mutual recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement between power and intellect. The meeting between Lucky Luciano and Bumpy Johnson wasn't supposed to change the balance of power in New York, but it did. When Luciano realized Bumpy wasn't an ordinary Harlem lieutenant, he recalibrated his entire approach. Instead of treating Harlem as territory to conquer, he began viewing it as territory to collaborate with. This alone was revolutionary. In the 1930s, organized crime was heavily segregated. Italian, Jewish, Irish, and black syndicates rarely interacted openly, and when they did, it usually involved exploitation or hostile takeover attempts. Respect across racial lines was almost unheard of. Luciano was not a typical mob boss. He believed in efficiency over prejudice, profit over ego. Bumpy was too valuable to be dismissed because of race. As Luciano and Bumpy talked further, a quiet but powerful shift happened in the room. The energy changed from interrogation to mutual analysis. Luciano recognized that Bumpy understood Harlem in a way no outsider ever could. And Bumpy recognized that Luciano, unlike Schultz, had no desire to humiliate Harlem's leadership. He wanted stability and structure. Their conversation evolved from testing to strategizing. Together, they began outlining what a peaceful working relationship could look like. Luciano would stop Italian intrusion into Harlem numbers operations. Harlem crews would maintain autonomy without being forced under Italian control. Profits would be shared fairly in certain joint operations. Violence would be minimized to keep police heat low on both sides. This was not a surrender, and it wasn't subservience. It was a negotiation between two sharp minds who understood sustainability better than domination. Bumpy didn't accept immediately. He asked direct questions, demanded respect, and insisted on clarity. Luciano appreciated this. In his world, most men agreed too fast out of fear. Bumpy negotiated calmly, confidently, and with Harlem's best interests at heart. This impressed Luciano more than anything else. By the time they shook hands, something historic had happened. Black strategist and an Italian crime architect had formed a cooperative understanding, one that broke racial norms and reset the underworld's expectations. Even more remarkable, Both sides understood the risks. Partnership would anger other bosses, ignite jealousy among rival gangs, and possibly draw law enforcement attention. Both men saw the larger vision: stability, profit, and order. For Bumpy, it wasn't just about making deals, it was about protecting Harlem from further exploitation and bloodshed. For Luciano, it was about integrating Harlem into his larger plan without igniting unnecessary wars. This handshake became the start of an alliance that would reshape New York's criminal landscape. It showed that brains, not brute force, could build bridges where violence had previously built walls. In the end, Luciano didn't just respect Bumpy, he needed him. And Bumpy, recognizing the power of strategic partnership, agreed to become Harlem's voice in Luciano's new organized system. It was the moment when two worlds, divided by race, history, and power, found common ground through intelligence and ambition. The moment word spread that Lucky Luciano and Bumpy Johnson had met, and more importantly, they shook hands instead of exchanging threats, the underworld reacted with shock. This wasn't just another street deal. It was a political earthquake. Rival gangs had expected a war, not an alliance. The idea of a black strategist being respected by the most influential Italian mob boss in New York created a ripple of jealousy, fear, and hidden hostility. First came the whispers. Italian crews loyal to Dutch Schultz were furious. Schultz had built his entire strategy around forcing his way into Harlem with violence and arrogance. Now, with Luciano recognizing Bumpy as an equal negotiator, Schultz's men felt humiliated. They viewed the alliance as betrayal, proof that Luciano did not trust Schultz's approach. Some of Schultz's men even accused Luciano of being soft, for considering partnership over domination. In their eyes, Harlem was supposed to be conquered, not negotiated with. But what they didn't understand was that Luciano wasn't weak. He was playing a smarter, longer game. Still, resentment brewed beneath the surface. Harlem's reaction was equally complicated. Some black crews, who were not aligned with Madame St. Clair, felt sidelined by Bumpy's rising influence. They weren't happy that he had become the bridge between Harlem and Luciano. Jealousy emerged from those who believed they deserved that role or feared Bumpy's new status would give him too much power. Certain independent gamblers thought Bumpy had gotten too close to the Italians, without realizing that his negotiations were designed to protect Harlem's autonomy, surrender it. But misunderstandings and ego are powerful forces in the streets. Even within St. Clair's own circles, everyone was pleased. A few lieutenants quietly questioned whether Bumpy's new connection might overshadow her authority. They didn't dare say it openly. St. Clair was too powerful, but the tension was there, simmering behind forced smiles and polite nods. And then there were the outsiders, rival gangs from Brooklyn, Queens, and New Jersey, who saw the alliance as a threat to their own operations. If Luciano gained stable influence in Harlem and Bumpy secured protection from Italian interference, it meant stronger competition and fewer cracks to exploit. Hidden threats began emerging. Anonymous tips to police, sabotage attempts on gambling spots, spies trying to gather intel on the new alliance, whispers to ignite mistrust between Harlem and the Italians. These groups didn't want cooperation, they wanted chaos. Chaos meant opportunity, but Bumpy was too sharp to be blindsided. He anticipated jealousy. He recognized the quiet moves being made in the shadows, and instead of reacting with violence, he tightened his network, strengthened loyalty among Harlem crews, and watched for any sign of betrayal. Luciano, too, understood the danger. He knew that even within his own organization, not everyone supported peace. Some preferred war, because war gave them excuses to steal, extort, or settle old grudges. Luciano had to keep his own lieutenants in line while preventing Schultz from spiraling completely out of control. What no one realized at the time was that this alliance, built on intelligence and respect, would trigger events far larger than a simple handshake. It would push Schultz closer to desperation, accelerate conflicts, and set in motion a chain of reactions that would soon erupt violently across New York. Behind the handshakes, there were already shadows forming. Behind the mutual respect, enemies were sharpening knives. Because power in New York never shifted quietly, someone always wanted blood. After hours of conversation, calculations, strategic hypotheticals, and quiet psychological tests, the meeting between Lucky Luciano and Bumpy Johnson reached its defining moment. Luciano wasn't a man who complimented easily. He believed praise weakened authority, and admitting another man's intelligence could shift the balance of power. But this time, he couldn't hide it. When Bumpy answered the final strategic scenario, one involving protecting Harlem's profits while minimizing casualties and maintaining political connections, Luciano fell silent. It wasn't the kind of silence that filled gaps, it was the kind that signaled reevaluation. He leaned forward, studying Bumpy with the eyes of a man who had finally found a mental equal. His lieutenants watched closely. They had never seen Luciano pause like this, not for a rival, not for a lieutenant, not for a business partner. Finally, Luciano exhaled and muttered words that would never appear in newspapers, but would echo through the Underworld Z. This man sees the board clearer than most. It wasn't just praise, it was a declaration, a recognition that Bumpy Johnson possessed a level of strategic intelligence that rivaled, and in some areas exceeded, the top minds in organized crime. Luciano wasn't simply acknowledging Bumpy's smarts, he was acknowledging Bumpy's worldview. Bumpy saw patterns in people, in money flow, in political shifts, in turf stability. He understood when to act, when to wait, when to push, when to pull back. It was chess logic applied to real streets. This moment changed Luciano's entire perception of Harlem. It was no longer a territory filled with numbers runners and local bosses. It was a battlefield led by a strategist who could influence outcomes far beyond his neighborhood. Luciano recognized that Bumpy didn't react emotionally, didn't jump to violence, didn't fear powerful men, didn't exaggerate or bluff, didn't reveal more than necessary. Instead, Bumpy evaluated situations like a mathematician calculates risks. That level of discipline made him dangerous in a reckless way, but in a controlled, measured way that Luciano deeply respected. That's when Luciano made his internal decision. Harlem would not be fought. Harlem would be respected. And Bumpy Johnson would be the person he listened to. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. In the racially divided 1930s underworld, an Italian crime boss acknowledging a black strategist as an equal, and even superior in certain strategic areas, was unheard of. It broke unwritten rules, challenged prejudices, and signaled a new era in New York's criminal politics. After the meeting, as Luciano and his lieutenants left the room, one of them whispered, "Boss, you think we can trust him?" Luciano didn't answer immediately. He glanced back toward the door, where Bumpy had just exited, then said quietly, "He's the only one in Harlem thinking while everyone else is reacting. You don't fight a man like that. You work with him." This single meeting and Luciano's rare acknowledgement set the foundation for one of the most unusual strategic alliances in criminal history. It solidified Bumpy Johnson's position not just as Harlem's protector, but as one of the sharpest minds in the entire underworld.